When I attended my sister's birthday dinner, my seat was at the kids' table. BIL Smirked. Only important guests sit with the adults. Worse, there was no plate for me. Sister shrugged. Guess you're not that important. I stood up, took my gift, and said, then I'm leaving. Sister froze. I, 32M, never thought my own sister would humiliate me like this, but here we are. The invitation came 3 weeks ago. My sister was turning 35, and she wanted to celebrate with a proper dinner party at her house. She'd been planning it for months, talking about how elegant it would be, how she'd hired a caterer, how everyone important in her life would be there. I was genuinely excited for her. I spent considerable time picking out her gift, a vintage jewelry box she'd admired at an antique shop months earlier. It wasn't cheap, but she was my only sibling, and I wanted to make her birthday special. I even took the afternoon off work to make sure I looked presentable and arrived on time. When I pulled into their driveway, I noticed several cars I didn't recognize. My brother-in-law had always been particular about his social circle, preferring what he called successful people over family sometimes. I grabbed the beautifully wrapped gift and headed to the front door. My sister answered with a bright smile, hugging me briefly before ushering me inside. The house was transformed, dimmed lighting, elegant table settings, soft jazz playing in the background. About 15 people were already there, most of whom I'd never met. They were clustered in small groups, wine glasses in hand, engaged in what sounded like business conversations. My brother-in-law approached with that particular smile he reserved for moments when he felt superior. He gestured toward the dining room, and I followed, expecting to see where I'd be sitting for dinner. That's when I saw it. The main dining table was set for 12 adults, with proper place cards, cloth napkins, and what looked like the good china. But tucked in the corner was a smaller table, clearly meant for children, with paper plates, plastic cups, and cartoon-themed napkins. A single place card sat there with my name on it. I stared at it for a moment, certain there had been some mistake. My brother-in-law noticed my confusion and his smirk widened. He explained that only important guests would be sitting with the adults tonight. The kids' table was where I belonged, apparently. The words hit me like a physical blow. I looked around the room, taking in the faces of strangers who would be dining at the adult table while I sat alone at a table meant for children who weren't even attending this party. My sister appeared beside us, and I turned to her, expecting her to correct this obvious error. Instead, she glanced at the children's table and then back at me with an expression I'd never seen before, cold and dismissive. She told me that was indeed where I'd be sitting, as if it were the most natural thing in the world. I asked her if she was serious, my voice barely above a whisper. The humiliation was already burning in my chest, but I gave her a chance to make this right. She could have laughed it off as a joke, moved me to the main table, anything to show that I mattered to her as her brother. But she didn't. She shrugged and said I should be grateful to be invited at all. Then came the words that would replay in my mind for weeks afterward. She told me that if I wasn't important enough for the main table, maybe I wasn't important enough to be there at all. The room seemed to go quiet around us, though the other guests continued their conversations, oblivious to what was happening. I felt every eye in the vicinity watching this exchange, waiting to see how I'd respond to being publicly diminished by my own sister. I looked at the children's table again, then at the gift in my hands, the expensive, thoughtfully chosen present I'd been so excited to give her. The irony wasn't lost on me. I'd spent more on her birthday gift than some of these important guests probably had, yet I was being treated like an afterthought. That's when I noticed something else that made the situation even worse. The children's table had been set for one person, me, but there was no plate, no silverware, nothing to actually eat with or from. It was as if they'd forgotten I was a human being who might actually want to participate in the dinner portion of this dinner party. I pointed this out to my sister, asking how exactly I was supposed to eat. She glanced at the empty space in front of the single chair and shrugged again. She said she guessed I wasn't that important after all, as if my lack of dining implements was somehow my own fault. Something inside me snapped. I'd spent 32 years being the supportive younger brother. I'd helped her through her divorce from her first husband, lent her money when she was struggling, been there for every milestone and crisis. I'd welcomed her new husband into the family despite his obvious disdain for anyone he considered beneath his social status. I'd bitten my tongue through countless subtle insults and dismissive comments. But this was different. This wasn't just disrespect. It was deliberate cruelty designed to humiliate me in front of strangers. I stood there for what felt like an eternity, but was probably only seconds, weighing my options. I could sit at that pathetic table, endure the embarrassment, and pretend everything was fine. I could make a scene and demand better treatment. Or I could do something that would send a clear message about how I expected to be treated. I chose the third option. I walked over to the children's table, picked up the place card with my name on it, and tore it in half. The sound seemed unnaturally loud in the elegant dining room. Several conversations stopped as people turned to see what was happening. I told my sister that if I wasn't important enough to sit with the adults, eat off real plates, or be treated with basic respect, then I wasn't staying. I picked up my gift from where I'd set it down and tucked it under my arm. My sister's face went white. She started to say something, but I cut her off. I told her that when she decided she wanted a brother instead of a social liability, she could call me. Until then, she could enjoy her important guests and her perfect dinner party. The room had gone completely silent now. Even the jazz music seemed quieter. My brother-in-law's smirk had disappeared, replaced by something that looked almost like panic. He started to speak, probably to smooth things over, but I wasn't interested in hearing it. I walked toward the front door, my sister following behind me, suddenly finding her voice. She was saying my name, asking me to wait, to come back, that we could work this out. But her tone wasn't apologetic. It was annoyed, as if I were the one being unreasonable. I turned around one last time before leaving. I told her that I'd spent years making excuses for her behavior, convincing myself that family meant something to her. Tonight had shown me exactly what I meant to her, and it wasn't enough. I left her standing in her foyer in her elegant dress, surrounded by her important guests, holding a dinner party with an empty children's table in the corner. Update 1. The drive home was surreal. I kept replaying the evening, wondering if I'd overreacted, if I should have just endured it for the sake of family peace. But every time I pictured that pathetic table with no plate, no respect, no consideration for my basic dignity, I knew I'd made the right choice. My phone started buzzing about an hour after I got home. Text messages from my sister, then calls I didn't answer. The messages started apologetic but quickly turned accusatory. She said I'd ruined her party, embarrassed her in front of her guests, that I was being dramatic and childish. The irony of being called childish for refusing to sit at the children's table wasn't lost on me. My brother-in-law sent his own messages, trying to smooth things over with corporate speak about misunderstandings and moving forward. He suggested we meet for coffee to clear the air, as if this were some minor workplace disagreement rather than a fundamental lack of respect. I didn't respond to any of them. The next day, my sister called my parents. They lived across the country, so they hadn't been at the party, but they'd heard her version of events. My mother called me, confused and concerned. She said my sister had told them I'd stormed out over seating arrangements, that I'd been unreasonable and dramatic. I explained what had actually happened, not just the seating, but the complete absence of a place setting, the deliberate humiliation, the years of subtle disrespect that had led to this moment. My mother was quiet for a long time after I finished. She said she'd talk to my sister and get back to me. Update 2. A week passed before I heard from my parents again. My father called this time, and his tone was different, disappointed and sad rather than confused. He said they'd spoken to several people who'd been at the party, including my sister's neighbor who'd helped with setup. The truth had come out. The children's table hadn't been a last-minute decision or an oversight. My sister and brother-in-law had planned it specifically for me. They'd discussed it for weeks, debating whether to invite me at all. My brother-in-law had convinced her that having me there would be good for appearances, but that I shouldn't be treated as an equal to their real guests. The missing plate hadn't been forgotten. It had been deliberately omitted. The plan was to let me sit there for a while, then offer me leftovers after the important guests had finished eating. Like I was some kind of charity case they were grudgingly feeding. My father's voice was heavy with disappointment as he told me this. He said he'd raised us better than this, that he was ashamed of my sister's behavior. He also said something that surprised me, that this wasn't the first time she'd shown this side of herself, just the first time it had been so blatant. Apparently, she'd been making comments about my career, my apartment, my lifestyle for years. Comments my parents had dismissed as sibling rivalry, but now recognized as something more toxic. My brother-in-law had been encouraging this attitude, feeding her sense of superiority over her unsuccessful brother. My mother got on the phone and apologized for not seeing it sooner. She said they'd be having a serious conversation with my sister about respect and family values. I appreciated their support, but the damage was done. The sister I'd thought I knew, the one I'd helped through difficult times, celebrated with during good times, loved unconditionally, had never really existed. At least not in the way I'd believed. Update 3. 3 weeks after the party, my sister showed up at my apartment unannounced. I almost didn't answer the door, but curiosity got the better of me. She looked different, tired, less polished than usual. Her perfect image was showing cracks. She started talking before I'd even fully opened the door, explaining that the party had been a disaster after I left. Several guests had asked about the children's table, wondering why there was an empty place setting with no child present. When the truth came out, people had been uncomfortable, some leaving early. Her neighbor, who'd helped with setup and knew the real story, had apparently been less discreet than my sister had hoped. Word had spread through their social circle about how she'd treated her own brother. The important people she'd been trying to impress were now questioning her character. She said she wanted to apologize, to make things right between us. But as she talked, it became clear that her primary concern wasn't our relationship, it was her reputation. She was worried about how this made her look, not about how it had made me feel. I listened to her entire speech without interrupting. When she finished, I asked her one simple question. If none of this had blown up in her face, if her guests had never found out the truth, would she be here apologizing now? The silence that followed was answer enough. I told her that I appreciated her coming by, but that an apology motivated by social embarrassment rather than genuine remorse wasn't something I could accept. I said that when she was ready to acknowledge that what she'd done was wrong regardless of the consequences, we could talk. Until then, I wished her well, but I was done being treated as less than family by the person who should have valued me most. She left without another word, and I haven't heard from her since. The vintage jewelry box she'd wanted so badly is still sitting in my closet, still in its gift wrapping. Sometimes I think about returning it to the antique shop, but something stops me. Maybe it's a reminder of who I used to be, someone who would have endured any humiliation for the sake of family peace. I'm not that person anymore, and I'm better for it. My parents visit more often now, making sure I know that I'm valued and loved. They've stopped trying to mediate between my sister and me, recognizing that some bridges can't be rebuilt until both sides want them to be. I've learned that sometimes the most important gift you can give yourself is the refusal to accept treatment that diminishes your worth. That night at my sister's dinner party, I chose my dignity over family harmony, and I've never regretted that choice. Some seats aren't worth taking, no matter who's offering them.